Ed Tufte is a professor at Yale University and an author of a famous series of books that are focused on envisioning information. He believes that there's a gap between those who are creating the data, like researchers and scientists, and those who are visualizing the data, like graphic artists and managers. And in that gap, we lose or distort the information that we're trying to present. And so he has developed these guidelines for visualizing data, including striving for graphical integrity, maximizing data ink, avoiding chart junk, increasing data density, and applying aesthetic elegance. And we'll talk about each of these, but really, when you wrap them all up together, it's conveyed in his quote that states, the greatest number of ideas in the shortest time using the least amount of ink in the smallest space. So in essence, what we're doing is we're trying to pack as much data into a small space as we can, but do it in a way that we really emphasize the story and the data that we want to convey to our audience. So let's talk about each of these guidelines. The first guideline is to strive for graphical integrity, in which visual representations of data must tell the truth. The idea is that we shouldn't lose the data itself in the graphical presentation. So we should represent numbers in direct proportion to their quantities. We shouldn't distort them. If we have three values at like 5, 10, and 50, the corresponding bars of a chart should be in relative proportion to those values. That we should have clear, detailed, and thorough labeling. That we should show data variation, not design variation. Really, we want to focus our audience on the data, not the design. So if you're looking at the design, whether it's a fancy north arrow or a really neat line, then you've lost your audience because they're no longer looking at the data. We should always display money over time in deflated and standardized units. So if I'm showing information in dollars from 1970 to 2020, I either need to show it all in 2020 dollars or all in 1970 dollars. That graphics must not quote data out of context. The idea is that we have to be honest about the data we're presenting. And if you look at the example at the bottom, the one on the left is an example where the graphic presentation of the data distorts the underlying values. And so this graphic for fuel economy standards for autos shows the change in fuel economy standards from 1978 to 1985. And so in 1978, it was 18 miles per gallon. And in 1985, it was 27 and a half miles per gallon. And so that's roughly a 45% increase in the fuel economy standard. But if you look at the line in 1978 is about 0.6 inches long, and the one in 1985 is 5.3 inches long. That's about an 800% increase. And so the line proportion is not accurately and honestly representing the underlying data. The example on the right is a civil engineer and cartographer from France named Charles Menard, who designed this very elegant and famous map of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. This is what we call a flow map, and you can see that the troops are identified by the lines that both leave France, travel all the way to Moscow and back again. And then the thickness of the line represents the number of troops. And so you can see the troop loss traveling across Russia all the way to Moscow and then all the way back. And it becomes really clear why, when Napoleon crossed back over into France, he had not only lost the war, but lost his power as well. The second guideline for visualizing data is maximize data ink. The goal being, above all else, show the data. And so Tufte has divided graphics into data ink and non-data ink. Data ink are the actual data themselves, the qualitative and quantitative values. The non-data ink is everything else. It's the scales, labels, edges, title, any other elements that we utilize to help communicate the data ink. And in ineffective graphics, there's a lot more non-data ink than there is data ink. So if you look in the graphic on the far left-hand side of your screen, you can see this is an example of an ineffective graphic in which the total non-data ink is much greater than the data ink. And so the graphic in the middle, we actually take out all the non-data ink, all those things that are not relevant to the data themselves. So for example, the shading that is creating the three-dimensional effect and the trend line which is really unnecessary, or the overly detailed index lines. And then in the graphic on the far right-hand side, we're showing just the data ink. And so if you compare the graphic on the left side with the graphic on the right side, you can see that the graphic on the right side does a much better job of focusing the audience on the data. And that's really the goal, is to communicate the data to your audience. Another guideline for visualizing data is avoid chart junk. And so chart junk are the markings and visual elements that do not support the data. And you want to avoid these items because they're really distracting you from the actual data themselves. And in some cases, they can actually confuse your audience. So you want to get rid of heavier dark grid lines, unnecessary text, or gimmicky font faces or ornamental axes. It's really easy with software today because you have so many different options to pick some really fun fonts or really crazy neat lines. But if your audience starts looking at those things rather than the data themselves, you need to rethink your choices. You also need to try to avoid pictures, backgrounds, or icons. If you look at the image on the right, you can see this concept conveyed in a figure published in the Wall Street Journal and then redesigned by Charlie Kidd. The figure published in the Wall Street Journal includes a huge apple in there to draw readers' attention to quarterly iPhone shipments. But in utilizing that chart junk, it actually distorts the data itself. The last two bars in 2012, it's really kind of hard to see the bars because it intersects with the Apple icon. And if you look at the figure redesigned by Charlie Kidd, he gets rid of the chart junk and really focus the user on the data itself. You also want to avoid gradient shading, unnecessary dimensions, and any distracting supporting elements. Last, I want to suggest beware of the software defaults. Again, the software is really great because it provides a bunch of options and also can often present default options that are good. But we have to make choices as designers that the default option is the best option. And we shouldn't let the computer decide that. We should look at the graphic presentation through the eyes of your potential user and then make choices based on that.